My parents laughed at me across the table. They did it in front of my aunt and the family friend who kept bringing up investments and grandchildren like they were the latest smartphone everyone should own. My father made a joke about my permanent single status, and my mother followed with a little sharp laugh that made the rest of them lean in. They called me the perpetual project, as if I were a hobby they kept on a shelf. It hurt because they were my parents and because I had just handed them 200 pages of medical authorization and care instructions for my mother. I had spent the last 3 years managing pills, doctor's appointments, and the small humiliations of a body that stopped doing what she used to do. I was exhausted. I was up at 3 a.m. with a blood pressure cuff and a box of unmarked pills, and they sat opposite me at dinner with champagne flutes and jokes about how I should get on a dating app like normal people. You can say it was cruel language, and it was. But the thing that cut the deepest was the implied argument behind it, that because I wasn't partnered, I was less capable, less worthy, and less entitled to anything in my parents' world. When your parents treat you like a failure, it becomes a fact in the room. I could feel it settling into the corners of my life. I didn't leave that night. I couldn't. We lived in their house in a neighborhood with short, tidy lawns and a small walnut tree in the front yard. The house was paid off. My father had sold his company years ago and invested most of the proceeds in real estate and something he called passive income streams. There were legal documents stacked neatly in a drawer in his study, a family trust, powers of attorney, a pile of notarized forms. I knew the exact balance of one of the accounts because I'd transferred money between them once to cover my rent after a 6-month contract fell through. $67,240 in one account, 6 figures in another. The house, the car titles, the trust, those things tethered me in ways more complicated than a lease. My mother's dementia had begun as small lapses, misplaced keys, forgetting a neighbor's name. 3 winters ago, it accelerated. She needed help with banking and medication, and somewhere in the middle of that, they put me on the short list of people responsible for her care. It was not a decision I could easily step away from. There was no one else. My sister Emily lived 3 states away and sent emotional support texts and pictures of her own kids. She was a good sister, but not a local option. My father liked things tidy and decided practical things with the kind of calm that made disagreements feel childish. He set the rules and I followed them because my mother needed someone at home. That dependency, my legitimate caregiving responsibilities, was the fulcrum they used to press against me. It's simple. If ugly, until you can prove you have a safety net for the person who depends on you, you are vulnerable. I had student loans, a contract job that came and went, and a car with an old transmission. And I had no savings that equaled the value of the house. I had my name on nothing. I was, in their eyes, replaceable. After the birthday dinner, the tone changed to tactics. My father started making suggestions about my social life in front of the nurse who came twice a week. When the nurse left, he would turn to me and say, "It wouldn't hurt to have some company." When I tried to push back, to explain that I was doing everything I could to be available for Mom, he would smile and pivot to practicality. How a partner could help with a mortgage, with travel, with future stability. It was always framed like advice for my own good, which made it harder to fight. I began measuring every conversation I had with them, looking for the pause between sentences where I could be persuaded. Then the more formal things started, and they asked me to sign a new power of attorney form. It was an innocuous sheet of paper that shifted certain decisions over to my father if my mother could not make them. I remember staring at the signature line. Signing felt like accepting a particular kind of dependency in exchange for being the person who held the responsibility. But if I refused, they said, we would have to arrange for outside guardianship, which in their telling would be expensive and inconvenient. So I signed. The first wave of escalation was small and familiar: humiliation and exclusion. I was called dramatic at the end of year family brunch because I said I wanted to work remote more frequently. My father sent a text to relatives that I later saw during a visit. Still unattached. So good at caregiving though, such a trooper. It appeared in a group chat meant for cousins and second cousins. The message struck me because of the way it wrapped pity in a compliment, like a ribbon on an empty box. What I did after that was practical. I rearranged my days so I could be present for more doctor visits. I took on a night shift job at a small bookstore for extra cash. I cut my cable and started cooking for myself. When my contract job finally paid the invoice, I deposited the money into an account only I could access. It was not much, but it was something I could call mine. That measure of independence made them bristle. They would check in more often. They would criticize my meals. They would leave scathing post-it notes about the thermostat. The bumps became dense. My father called me into his study one afternoon and told me they were transferring the house into an irrevocable trust. He explained what it meant with the kind of calm that settles decisions into law. An irrevocable trust, he said, was a way to protect assets for the family. It would avoid probate. It would keep everything in order. There was a trustee, my sister Emily. She had married a man with a position at an investment firm and new forms apparently. Emily was named trustee and executor. My father asked me to trust the family plan. I closed my mouth and said I trusted him. I learned later I should have asked for copies of the documents. I should have asked who the beneficiaries were and what my position would be. Instead, I swallowed my unease and continued filling pill organizers. And the second wave of escalation was financial pressure. I was called late one night by a collections agency because an account connected to a medical bill had an overdue notice. I explained we had sent the check, that I had proof. The agent was polite and said that if the account wasn't cleared, they would escalate. The debt itself was small, $2,450, but it came with an unspoken threat, a paper trail that could be used to paint me as irresponsible. I cried into a dish towel because I had to keep my composure for my mother. Then there were the small exclusions that cut more than money. Invitations to my father's golf club dinners would stop arriving. My sister would show up to things in downtown restaurants with an armful of PR friends. The more they excluded me from social standing and decisions, the more they emphasized their control. They began to talk about legacy in front of me. Who would care for the garden? Who would manage the rental units? The language implied that if I wasn't married, I was not a logical steward of those things. I reacted with a certain stubbornness. I spent hours doing paperwork, calling the bank, pulling together a small portfolio of my own, a little retirement fund, a brokerage account opened in my name, a copy of my mother's records. I started to set up a separate mailbox at the corner post office. I wanted a paper trail that was mine. Each time I made a move, they would pivot. A cousin would call to ask prying questions about my personal life. My father would send a helpful list of local matchmaking events that made me feel like a joke. The third wave escalated into manipulation by proxy. My sister began to show up more often, and she was gentle in a way that felt like a trap. She would bring casseroles and sit with Mom during my longer work days. She would tell me how grateful she was that I was handling the day-to-day. Then, in the same breath, she would say, "You should think about long-term plans, for Mom." It was a slow drip, gratitude on the surface, pressure at the bottom. My father, who used to be a private kind of man, started sharing more of the family's private financial decisions with their lawyer in ways I only discovered later. Paperwork moved faster. The trust's language became stricter. A clause about stable cohabitation appeared, phrased in a way that suggested a partner would have to meet certain expectations before being counted as a beneficiary. The clause had been hidden in a redraft. I found it when I later asked for a copy of the trust, and the lawyer emailed one over, subject line, final draft. When I pointed out the clause, asked why it was there, my father smiled and said he had been thinking about the future. He said things like, "What would you do without someone to help? You're worn out." He said it in a tone meant to reassure, but I heard the thud of judgment. My reaction was quiet and angry. I stopped sharing details about my day. I stopped asking for permission. I paid for a private colleague to review a few legal forms. I started working 2 jobs, and I dated briefly and awkwardly and without much fanfare because I wanted to prove I had agency. They noticed. They mocked me less because they thought it was my choice. They mocked me more because they thought none of it mattered. An important change happened when I met Julian. I met him at a fundraiser where I had been volunteering to help set up tables. He was not flashy about it. He wore a well-tailored coat and asked a question about the charity's annual budget that reflected a mind used to running things. He introduced himself quietly, and we talked about my mother's illness more than our hobbies. He listened with something like ordinary decency, and then over gradual dinners, more attentively. He was careful, not theatrical. He had an address in the files as an investor and a title that suggested dozens of people reported to him. It was hard to reconcile that with the person who sent me home-cooked soup the week I had a bad night and showed up at my mother's bedside without ceremony. We were not secretive, but we kept the relationship measured. I didn't tell my parents about him right away because I wanted to protect the small corner of life that felt safe. When I did mention him months later, they did their best to dismiss him in the same way they dismissed me. "Who is he?" my father wanted to know, and then, "Is he local? Where does he come from?" He asked about his career like it was a crossword clue. Later, so after a Sunday visit, they began scrutinizing the name in an odd way, like readers trying to compare a plot point between chapters. The escalation cycles accelerated once they perceived a threat. There was the time I came home to find an eviction notice taped to the front door. The notice was for a room in the carriage house, a small space my parents had rented out when guests came through. They had removed my name from the lease. The reason given was ambiguous. A clerical error, they said in the follow-up call. But the message was clear. Small, bureaucratic actions can be frighteningly effective. It was the kind of thing that left me cold because it revealed how quickly institutional levers could be used to isolate me. I reacted by calling the landlord, then Emily, and then my father. Each conversation left me less reassured. My father said, in a tone that sounded like mercy, that the landlord had made a mistake and he would fix it. I believed him because I still believed in the soundness of family promises. The situation got worse when a bank froze access to a safety deposit box I had used for my mother's advance directives. It turned out the bank had received a call from my father's attorney saying the directives needed to be secured. The bank froze the box pending confirmation. For a week, I could not access the legal paperwork I might have needed. I felt foolish when I sat in the chair in the city branch and allowed the clerk to read me the polite corporate script about compliance and policy. The freeze felt like a small, clinical kind of betrayal. When your paperwork is weaponized against you, the emotional weight is different. It's quiet. It's efficient. My reaction was to fight back with process. I filed a formal request for copies of the trust. I sent certified letters asking for an explanation of the bank freeze. I hired a paralegal friend to help me read through the trust. I kept detailed logs of who called and who said what. The new evidence came slowly, layer by layer, like dust settling on a shelf. Each new discovery changed the angle. I found a clause that allowed the trustee to sell the family home if a majority of trustees agreed it was in the best fiscal interest of the trust. I learned the trustee had the right to deny accommodation to those who did not meet the stability clause. It was written in legalese, but the meaning was clear. If I wanted to challenge it, I needed resources. If I wanted to prove undue influence, I needed a timeline. The fourth wave of escalation moved from exclusion and paper shuffling into direct emotional manipulation. My mother, in a lucid moment, asked me if I felt loved. She held my hand and looked at me with a softness that made me want to break apart and put the fragments in my pocket. I told her I did. Later the same week, she repeated something my father had said about me needing a partner. She had been coached, I realized. Meals, comments that echoed lines I had only heard from him. The recognition of that made the betrayal feel sterner. Somebody had been filling her head with narratives about my inadequacy. At each point, I reacted. I investigated. I hired a lawyer to look at the trust. The lawyer said there was cause for concern. Irrevocable doesn't mean invincible, she said. If there was coercion or fraud, there are remedies. Her phrase was clinical, but it carried a possibility. She wanted money up front, and that was another pressure. Litigation costs are not romantic. They are hourly and tidy, and they require retainer checks. This set up a practical test. Did I have the resources to take the fight to paper and process? I had one asset that might help. I had been dating Julian for a year. He was private, but not inaccessible. One afternoon, when I was sitting at my kitchen table with a stack of bills and a legal estimate that made me breathe shallowly, he came by. He watched me as I explained the sequence of events, the trust clauses, the bank freeze, the eviction notice. He listened in a way that felt like someone cataloging facts in a ledger, not coldly, but methodically. He asked a few simple questions. Then he placed his hand over mine and said, "We can handle this." There was a quiet agreement in that sentence. He offered to help in ways that were practical. He did not make promises about changing the heart of my parents. He mentioned lawyers, forensic accountants, and a timeline. He also said he would not use his money to bully them. He said he wanted resolution, not theater. That line mattered to me because I had no interest in making a spectacle of my family. I wanted boundaries and safety. The escalation loop intensified when my father noticed Julian's involvement. My father's face tightened when I mentioned the names of the lawyers Julian wanted to consult. He became more strategic, more brittle. He called me in his office and asked for a frank conversation. He said, we're only trying to organize the estate sensibly. He did not raise his voice. He used the tone people use when their authority isn't to be questioned. He asked whether Julian intended to gain from our relationship. It was a plain question about intentions that assumed the worst. I answered calmly. I said Julian was my partner and that he was offering help because he wanted me to be safe. He was clear that the help came with conditions, a prenuptial agreement, a request for time to assess the legal situation. He wanted things to be clear. That infuriated my father because it highlighted his vulnerability in the legal realm. For the first time in a long while, I saw the edge in his composure. It was like watching a man try to keep his balance as the floor subtly shifted. The situation went sideways in a manner I had not predicted. One morning, an eviction notice for the main house arrived at our mailbox. This time, it wasn't a clerical error. It was a notice of trustee intent to sell the property, citing maintenance costs and maximizing trust value. I remember I held the envelope until the edges softened in my fingers. The trustee had published a notice in the paper. Emily's name was on it. Panic is not a dramatic thing. It is a steady, cold calculation. I called my lawyer, I called Julian, I called Emily, but she did not pick up. When she finally answered, she sounded guarded. "We're following the documents," she said. The documents had become the weapon. This was the low point. For a week, I felt stripped of leverage. The house, what we had always called the family home, was on the table for sale. My mother's care could be moved to a facility if the trust decided it serendipitously reduced costs. My father's calm had hardened into denial. Emily was evasive. The bank was polite but distant. The legal estimate on the cost of halting a trustee sale was larger than I had expected. I sat on the kitchen floor and cried like a child because that was what remained to me. Pure, unfiltered grief. I woke up at 3 a.m. and thought about leaving the house physically. Where would I go? Who would care for my mother in the night? The low point was not a dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet realization of how little power I had when the legal machinery was aligned against me. I had been the one doing all the small, constant acts of care, phone calls, pill organizers, doctor's notes, and yet I had no title on the trust. Then the turning point came from something small and ordinary, a courier with a brown envelope. Inside were copies of emails my father had written to his lawyer and to the trust's notary in the weeks before the trust's final draft. The courier handed it to my mother by mistake. He had been instructed to deliver to the estate office but had taken a wrong turn. My mother, in a lucid moment, gave it to me. I read the emails at the kitchen table with Julian beside me. The words were plain, references to reassigning assets for tax purposes, to minimizing risk by tightening beneficiary criteria, and a line that made my stomach drop. Ensure no distributions to non-married caregivers until stability criteria are met. There were notes about calls with a notary and proposed language for the trust that seemed to originate from one of the attorney officers Julian's team later flagged as using questionable expedited signings for elderly clients. It wasn't a smoking gun of fraud, but it was evidence of intent and an unevenness in the normal process, an urgency that did not match the circumstances. Julian's team ran the emails through a forensic check. They found something else, an electronic timestamp on the notary's file that suggested the final signing happened after my father's capacity had clearly declined. There were telephone records that did not line up with my father's recollection. Nothing in that pile of paper was definitive on its own, but together they formed a pattern that could be tested in court. That document, the courier's envelope, a simple administrative error, shifted the power dynamic. For the first time, I had concrete leads. For the first time, the legal story could be told in a way that might force a negotiation. It also infuriated my father because it meant someone could open the trust and scrutinize the signings. We did not storm into the house and declare victory. We approached it the way Julian liked to approach problems, methodically. His lawyers sent a polite letter requesting a pause in any sale, pending review. My father's team called ours and asked for mediation. Emily panicked and started to text me, though her texts were defensive. The change did not erase the night we had sat on the kitchen floor, but it provided a doorway. The consequences were slow and unglamorous. There was no cinematic courtroom battle or public shaming. There were meet and confer calls that went on for weeks. There was a mediation session with a neutral attorney who asked quiet questions about capacity. My mother was asked to sit with doctors who evaluated her capacity to sign documents at the time. Her memory was inconsistent, and the doctor's notes were careful and clinical. Legally, there was a spectrum of outcomes. If the trust signings had happened when my father still had capacity, the trust would likely stand. If not, we might have a case. The reality was more complicated. These disputes often settle because continued litigation is expensive and uncertain. Julian's willingness to fund a legal schedule mattered because it changed the calculus. The trustees' willingness to defend the actions spelled more uncertainty for them. In the end, they settled. The settlement was not the kind of courtroom vindication you see in movies. It was a negotiated agreement that required compromise and did not fully satisfy anyone. The trustee agreed to rescind the sale notice and to restructure the trust in a way that gave me certain rights: a life tenancy, agreement for the main house, a modest distribution that would cover caregiving costs, and the appointment of an independent co-trustee to oversee future asset decisions. Emily retained her role, but with limits. My father agreed to a conservatorship for decisions involving large financial moves. There were costs. Litigation fees consumed a portion of the settlement. The relationships I once considered reliable were frayed beyond what casual apologies could repair. Emily did not speak to me for months. My father and I had an awkward dinner where we took turns talking about the weather. My mother's condition continued to decline, and I found myself caring for her in a house now governed by a new set of documents and terms. There were quieter and meaningful consequences too. I learned to keep copies of documents. I learned how to ask direct questions. I learned, not in any sweeping way, in that people you love can hurt you in patterns that are slow and legal and terrifying. I learned that money gives people leverage, and that leverage changes how they speak to you. The settlement created stability and financial autonomy, which meant I could hire help: a night nurse for mom, a housekeeper, and that, in turn, made it possible for me to consider work that wasn't tied to the immediate rhythms of caregiving. For the first time in years, I looked at a job listing that required travel and didn't feel my chest clench. Julian never used his wealth like a club. He paid bills quietly, set up accounts in my name, and helped arrange a trust for my mother that treated her with more procedural respect. He insisted on a prenuptial agreement so there would be no confusion later. Well, I signed it because I understood what it meant, clarity and boundaries. We were both pragmatic about what marriage would do and not do. The end result was not a tidy revision to the family narrative. Emily and I spoke on the phone once to set a date to visit my mother together. The call was short and awkward, and it felt honest. My father and I met with a mediator and talked about the garden beds. We did not heal overnight, nor did I suddenly become the person my parents once thought I should be. There was, however, a kind of relief. Relief is an under-celebrated emotion. It's not dramatic, it's practical. I had space to breathe. The house remained ours in the sense that I could stay, and the life tenancy agreement meant I was not beholden to the whim of a trustee who could sell it at a moment's notice. The settlement bought me time and autonomy. It bought a different kind of respect, one enforced by paper, but still real. We married a year later. The wedding was small because my mother was fragile and because the experience had altered my appetite for spectacle. Julian slipped an understated ring onto my finger at my mother's bedside. It was not meant to humiliate my parents or to puncture old wounds. It was meant to acknowledge the life we were entering together, care, partnership, and an agreement about the kind of boundaries we would keep. My father did not attend the ceremony. Emily came for a short while and left before the cake. The family dynamics did not dissolve into a simple story of good and bad. They simmered. There were predictably awkward conversations afterward. People compared notes about who was to blame. There were relatives who whispered. There were others who were practical and helpful. I offered my mother a steady presence until she died 2 years later. Those years were tender in ways grief makes you reluctant to name. A hand in a hospital room, a laugh remembered, a private conversation when the lights were low. In the end, she died with someone at her bedside who had loved her for reasons that had nothing to do with wills and trusts. When I look back, I try to remember the sequence without a hero's arc. There was no grand vindication that made everyone sit up and applaud. The truths were smaller, evidence matters, legal structures matter, and the people who want to control you will use the elegantly boring machinery of paperwork to do it. It's not glamorous, it's sustained, it's quiet and relentless. The ring walking in with Julian beside me at the bedside the day we signed the agreement was not a surprise. It was a pragmatic movement towards security. It felt, oddly, like permission to take care of myself in the way I had taken care of my mother. I don't tell you this to moralize. I tell you because I want to keep the story true to the way it felt. Not cinematic, but intimate. I want to be clear that wealth and power shift the lines, but they do not create simple solutions. Money bought us options, lawyers, mediators, and time. It did not buy sincerity or a perfect family. The emotional fallout lasted, and some wounds took longer to settle than I expected. If you've stayed with me this long, thank you. If anything in my story resonates with you, whether it's a parent's cruelty dressed up as concern, the long, slow drain of responsibility, or the strange relief of having someone stand beside you when paperwork becomes a form of power. Tell me in the comments. I'm not asking for sympathy, I'm asking for connection. It helps me to hear if the details ring true for someone else. If you like the story, please leave a like. If you want to hear more, things I learned about paperwork, boundaries, and the small acts that keep you afloat, subscribe. And if you've had a similar experience, I'd like to know what was the smallest thing that made you feel safe again.